Chapter 1. Dinner. My name is Nick Carraway. I come from a respected family in the Midwest. My father once gave me important advice. He said, "Before you judge someone, remember that not everyone has had the same chances as you." I have always tried to follow this advice. After finishing university at Yale, I joined the Army and fought in World War I. When the war ended, I felt restless. I wanted to do something important with my life. So, in 1922, I moved to West Egg, a small town near New York City. I wanted to work in the bond business, a job in finance. West Egg was a strange place. Many new rich people lived there. They had huge houses, threw big parties, and spent money easily. I rented a small house on the shore of Long Island Sound. It was not fancy, but it was comfortable. The rent was $80 a month, and I lived there alone. Next to my house was a huge mansion. It looked like a castle. It had tall towers, large windows, and a big swimming pool. The house belonged to a man named Gatsby. I did not know much about him, but I often saw lights shining from his house at night. Many cars and people went in and out. Gatsby had big parties every weekend. Visiting the Buchanans across the bay was East Egg. It was different from West Egg. The people in East Egg were from old rich families. They had inherited their money from their ancestors. They believed they were better than the new rich people in West Egg. My cousin Daisy Buchanan and her husband Tom Buchanan lived in East Egg. Tom and I went to university together. He was a strong, athletic man. In college, he was a famous football player. Now he was rich and lived in a big mansion with servants. One evening, Tom invited me to dinner at their house. When I arrived, their red and white mansion was beautiful. The front door was open, and Tom stood outside on the porch. He wore riding clothes and looked confident and proud. Inside, the living room was large and bright. Daisy sat on a big sofa, laughing. She was a beautiful woman with bright eyes and a soft voice. Next to her was Jordan Baker, a famous golfer. She was tall, slim, and serious. Daisy was charming and playful. She asked me many questions about my life. She told me she had a 3-year-old daughter, but the girl was asleep. "She is beautiful," Daisy said. "I hope she will be a fool. That is the best thing a girl can be in this world." During dinner, the phone rang. A servant told Tom that it was a call from New York. Tom looked serious and left the table. Daisy suddenly became quiet. Jordan leaned closer to me and whispered, "That call is from Tom's girlfriend." After dinner, we sat outside on the porch. The wind was soft and the sky was dark. Daisy told me she was unhappy. She said, "I have had a bad time, Nick. I feel tired of everything." A mysterious figure. Later, I left and drove home. The night was calm and peaceful. When I got out of my car, I saw a man standing near Gatsby's house. He was tall and alone. His hands were in his pockets, and he was looking across the bay. I was about to call out to him, but then he did something strange. He slowly stretched his arms forward, as if trying to reach something far away. I followed his eyes and saw a small green light shining in the distance. It was at the end of a dock across the bay. I looked back at the man, but he was gone. He had disappeared into the night. The green light continued to shine. I stood there for a long time, thinking about who he was and what he wanted. The night was quiet again, but I had a feeling that something mysterious was about to happen. Chapter 2: A Trip to New York, the Valley of Ashes. Halfway between West Egg and New York, there is a strange place. It is called the Valley of Ashes. This place is gray, dusty, and dirty. The ground is covered in ash, and smoke rises in the air. People who live here are poor and tired. There is a billboard in the Valley of Ashes. On it, 2 giant blue eyes stare down. These eyes belong to Dr. T.J. Eckelberg. They are painted on a huge sign for an old eye doctor's office. The sign is faded and forgotten, but the eyes watch everything in the valley. One afternoon, Tom Buchanan and I were on the train to New York. Suddenly, Tom stood up and pulled me off the train. "I want you to meet my girl," he said. We walked across the dusty road to a garage. The sign said, "Wilson's Garage, cars bought and sold." A man came out. His name was George Wilson. He was thin, pale, and tired. His clothes were dirty, and his hair was messy. Tom spoke to him. "I have a car for you," Tom said. Wilson's face lit up. He needed money. Then a woman walked down the stairs. She was not beautiful, but she looked strong and confident. She wore a dark blue dress and had bright red lips. She was Myrtle Wilson, George's wife. Myrtle ignored her husband and walked straight to Tom. Her eyes were full of life. Tom looked at her and smiled. "Meet me at the train station," Tom whispered. She nodded and smiled back. Then she turned to her husband. "I'm going to visit my sister in New York," she said. "The secret apartment." Myrtle took a different train, and we met her later in New York City. Tom took us to a small apartment on 158th Street. This was Tom and Myrtle's secret place. They used it to hide their affair. Inside, the apartment was small but full of furniture. The air smelled like perfume and smoke. Myrtle changed into a tight dress and high heels. She looked happy. More people arrived. Catherine, Myrtle's sister, came first. She had red hair and a thin face. Then the McKees, a married couple, arrived. Mr. McKee was a photographer, and his wife was loud and talkative. There was a lot of drinking. Myrtle laughed loudly and acted like a rich woman. She talked about how she met Tom. "I was on the train," she said. "When I saw Tom, I knew he was different. He was wearing an expensive suit and shiny shoes. I couldn't stop looking at him." She smiled proudly. Catherine started talking about Gatsby. "I heard Gatsby is a cousin of the German king," she said. "That's not true," I said. "Nobody knows the truth." She laughed. The room was hot and noisy. I felt dizzy from the drinks. I wanted to leave, but the party continued. A violent end to the night. Myrtle kept talking about Daisy, Tom's wife. "I don't understand why he married her," she said. "Daisy is weak." Tom's face became hard. Myrtle laughed and shouted, "Daisy! Daisy! Daisy!" Suddenly, Tom raised his hand and hit her in the face. Myrtle screamed and fell back. Blood ran from her nose. The room went silent. Everyone looked away, pretending nothing had happened. A little later, I left the apartment. I don't remember how I got home. I woke up at a train station, feeling tired and confused. Chapter 3. Gatsby's Party. Gatsby's Mysterious Parties. Gatsby was a very rich man, and every weekend his house was full of people. He threw huge, exciting parties. People came from everywhere, from New York, from Long Island, and even from other cities. These parties were wild and beautiful. The garden was filled with colorful lights, the music was loud and lively, and the guests danced until morning. Waiters walked through the crowd carrying silver trays with glasses of champagne and cocktails. People arrived in expensive cars, in long dresses, in fancy suits. Some came with friends, others alone, but nobody was ever turned away. They ate rich food, roast beef, baked hams, fresh salads, and cold meats. They drank champagne, whiskey, and gin. Nobody really knew Gatsby. People only talked about him. There were rumors everywhere. "I heard Gatsby killed a man," whispered one woman. No, he was a spy during the war," said a man. "Some say he is a prince from Europe," said another. Nobody knew the truth, but everyone enjoyed his parties. An invitation from Gatsby. One Saturday, while I was sitting at home, a chauffeur in a black suit came to my door. "Mr. Gatsby invites you to his party tonight," he said, handing me a formal invitation. I was surprised. Most guests were never invited. They just showed up. But I had a special invitation. That evening, I dressed carefully. I wore white flannel trousers and a dark jacket. Then, I walked next door to Gatsby's grand mansion. The party had already started. The garden was full of guests. Some people were talking loudly, others were laughing. I could hear the sound of glasses clinking and music from an orchestra. I walked through the crowd, feeling a little lost. I didn't know anyone. Then I saw Jordan Baker. She was standing near the cocktail table talking to two girls in yellow dresses. I walked over and smiled. "Hello, Jordan," I said. She turned and looked at me. "Oh, Nick, I thought you might be here." The man in the library. Jordan and I decided to explore the house. Inside, the mansion was even more beautiful. The rooms were huge, filled with crystal chandeliers and gold-trimmed furniture. Servants walked around, carrying trays of drinks and food. We entered a large library. The walls were covered with books. In the middle of the room, a middle-aged man sat in a chair. He wore thick glasses and had a big round face. He was very drunk. "These books are real," the man shouted. Jordan laughed. "Of course they are real." No, you don't understand," the man said. "Rich people buy fake books for decoration, but Gatsby's books are real books with real pages. That means something, don't you think?" Jordan and I laughed and left the library. Meeting Gatsby. Later, Jordan and I sat at a table near the pool. A man in a white suit sat next to me. He was friendly and polite. We talked about the war. "Were you in the war?" he asked me. "Yes," I said. "I was in France." "So was I," the man said. "I was in the 7th Infantry." We talked about old war stories. He smiled at me, then suddenly said, "I'm Gatsby." I was shocked. "You are Gatsby?" I asked. He laughed. Yes, old sport. I had imagined Gatsby very differently. I thought he would be older, fatter, serious. But Gatsby was young, handsome, and friendly. His smile was warm and kind. "I'm very happy to meet you, old sport," he said. "I hope you enjoy my party." He spoke softly but with confidence. His voice was full of energy. "Do you want to try my speedboat tomorrow?" Gatsby asked. I agreed. Gatsby was charming and easy to talk to. A secret conversation with Jordan. Later that night, a butler came and whispered to Jordan, "Mr. Gatsby would like to speak with you," he said. Jordan looked surprised. She stood up and followed the butler into the house. She was gone for nearly an hour. When she returned, she looked excited. "I just heard something incredible about Gatsby," she said. "What is it?" I asked. She smiled mysteriously. "I can't tell you yet," she said. "But you'll find out soon." I wanted to ask more, but she refused to say anything. The car accident. The party continued late into the night. Some guests were too drunk to stand. People laughed, danced, and talked loudly. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the driveway. A car had crashed into a ditch near Gatsby's house. Everyone ran outside to look. The driver stumbled out of the car. He was very drunk and confused. "What happened?" someone asked. "I don't know," the driver said. "Did we run out of gas?" Everyone laughed and shouted, but Gatsby's party continued as if nothing had happened. The mystery of Gatsby. I walked home feeling tired, but excited. Gatsby was a mystery. He was kind and polite, but very private. Unlike the other guests, he did not drink too much. He did not laugh loudly or dance wildly. He simply watched his guests and smiled. I knew Gatsby had a secret. I wanted to understand him. As I looked back at Gatsby's bright mansion, I felt that something important was going to happen. Chapter 4. Gatsby's Story and a Secret Plan. A list of guests. Gatsby's parties were famous. Every weekend, rich and important people came. Some guests were actors, politicians, and businessmen. Others were young men and women who wanted fun. One morning, I sat down and wrote a list of names. These were people who came to Gatsby's house in the summer. There were guests from East Egg and West Egg. Some guests were rich bankers, others were criminals. Many had strange stories about Gatsby. I wondered, who was Gatsby really? A drive with Gatsby. One day, Gatsby invited me to lunch in New York. That morning, his yellow car arrived at my house. The car was large, bright, and expensive. Gatsby was driving. He was wearing a white suit and looked excited. "I want to tell you about myself," he said. I listened carefully. "I come from a rich family in the Midwest," he said. "I was educated at Oxford because it is a family tradition." I was surprised. Gatsby did not look like an Oxford man. He continued, "After my parents died, I traveled around the world. I lived like a prince. I hunted in Europe, collected jewels, and painted in Italy. Then I fought in the war. The government gave me a medal for bravery." He showed me the medal. It had his name on it. Then he took out a small photo. "This is me at Oxford," he said. I looked at the photo. Gatsby was smiling with young men in suits. I was confused. Maybe his stories were true. Meeting Meyer Wolfsheim We arrived in New York. Gatsby took me to a small restaurant. Inside, a man was sitting. He had a round face and small dark eyes. He wore a large ring on his finger. "This is Meyer Wolfsheim," Gatsby said. Wolfsheim shook my hand. He smiled, but his eyes watched me closely. Gatsby told me, "He is a businessman. He knows many important people." Wolfsheim talked about the past. "This place was full of gangsters before," he said. "One night a man was shot here." I felt uncomfortable. Then Wolfsheim said something strange. "I fixed the World Series in 1919, he said. I was shocked. The World Series was a famous baseball game. Wolfsheim bribed the players to make sure one team won. I looked at Gatsby. He smiled but said nothing. I thought, who is Gatsby really? Why does he know criminals? A story from Jordan. After lunch, I saw Jordan Baker. She had important news for me. She said, "Nick, Gatsby has a secret." I listened carefully. 5 years ago, Gatsby was in love with Daisy Buchanan, she said. I was surprised. They met in Louisville when Gatsby was a young soldier. Daisy was beautiful and rich. Gatsby was poor, but they loved each other. Gatsby went to war, and Daisy waited for him. But later, she married Tom Buchanan because Tom was rich. Gatsby bought his mansion in West Egg to be close to Daisy. He throws parties every weekend, Jordan said. He hopes that one day Daisy will come to his house. I now understood Gatsby's real dream. Gatsby wants to see Daisy again, Jordan said. But he is afraid. Then she smiled at me. That's why he invited you to lunch, she said. He wants you to invite Daisy to your house. Then Gatsby will come too. He wants to meet Daisy again. I thought about this secret plan. Did Daisy still love Gatsby? What would happen if she saw him again? I didn't know the answers, but I agreed to help. Chapter 5. The Reunion, a late-night visit from Gatsby. That night I came home late. It was dark and everything was quiet. But then I saw something strange. Gatsby's house was bright with lights. Every window was shining. I thought he was having another big party, but I heard no music and saw no guests. Then I saw Gatsby walking toward me. "Let's go to Coney Island, old sport," he said. I laughed. "It's too late." "What about a swim in my pool?" he asked. "I have to sleep," I said. Gatsby looked nervous. He did not want to leave. "I talked to Jordan Baker," I told him. "I will invite Daisy for tea at my house." Gatsby's face changed. He looked excited and afraid at the same time. "Which day is best for you?" I asked. "Which day is best for you?" he answered quickly. "I don't want to trouble you." "How about the day after tomorrow?" I said. Gatsby thought for a moment. "I want to cut the grass before she comes," he said. I smiled. Gatsby wanted everything to be perfect. Preparations for Daisy's visit. The next day, Gatsby sent a gardener to cut my grass. At 2 o'clock, a delivery truck arrived. Gatsby had sent hundreds of flowers to decorate my house. I looked at my small living room. It was now full of white roses. At 3 o'clock, Gatsby arrived. He wore a white suit, a silver shirt, and a gold tie. His hair was perfectly combed, but he looked very pale. "Everything is ready," I said. Gatsby sat down, but he could not sit still. He looked out the window, waiting for Daisy. At 3:30, the sky was gray and rainy. Then, there was a soft knock at the door. Gatsby and Daisy meet again. I opened the door. Daisy stood outside, holding a wet umbrella. "Am I late?" she asked happily. "No," I said. "Come in." Gatsby had disappeared. I looked around. I found him in the kitchen. His face was pale, and he looked very nervous. "You're acting like a boy," I said. Gatsby took a deep breath and walked into the living room. Daisy turned and saw him. They stood facing each other. "We've met before," Gatsby muttered. Daisy's face turned pink. "I know," she whispered. For a moment, nobody spoke. The only sound was the rain outside. Then Gatsby knocked over a clock. It fell, but he caught it just in time. Daisy laughed softly. "I'm sorry," Gatsby said quickly. "Don't worry," Daisy said. She looked at him with soft eyes. The tension in the room slowly disappeared. A tour of Gatsby's house. After tea, Gatsby invited us to his house. He showed Daisy every room. He wanted her to see how rich he was. His bedroom was huge. He opened a big wooden closet and pulled out shirts. "They are from England," he said. He threw them on the bed, shirts of every color. Daisy touched the shirts. "They are so beautiful," she said. Then, suddenly, she started crying. "Why are you crying?" Gatsby asked. "Because I've never seen such lovely shirts before," she said. But I knew she was not crying about the shirts. She was crying about the past. A moment of happiness. Gatsby took Daisy to the window. "Look," he said. He pointed to the green light at the end of her dock. Daisy nodded slowly. Gatsby smiled. For years he had looked at that green light, hoping to see Daisy again. Now, she was here. He did not need the green light anymore. As I watched them, I realized something important. Gatsby had dreamed about Daisy for 5 years. He had imagined her as perfect. But now, she was real. Would the real Daisy be enough for Gatsby's big dream? I did not know the answer. I left them alone and walked outside into the rain. Chapter 6. Gatsby's Past and a New Party. A reporter comes to Gatsby's house. One morning, a reporter came to Gatsby's door. "Do you have anything to say?" the reporter asked. "About what?" Gatsby said politely. The reporter hesitated. He had heard Gatsby's name many times in his office. People talked about Gatsby everywhere. The reporter did not know the truth, but he wanted a story. Gatsby smiled and did not answer. The truth about Gatsby's past. People said many things about Gatsby. Some said he was a spy, others said he was a prince. But nobody knew the real story. His real name was James Gatz. He was born poor in North Dakota. His parents were farmers, but he never accepted that life. At 17, he changed his name to J. Gatsby. He wanted to be rich and successful. One day, Gatsby saw a yacht on Lake Superior. The yacht belonged to Dan Cody, a rich man. Gatsby borrowed a boat and went to warn Cody about a storm. Cody was impressed with Gatsby. He hired him as a personal assistant. Gatsby traveled the world with Cody on the yacht. He learned about money, power, and success. Cody died suddenly, leaving a lot of money. But Gatsby received nothing because Cody's wife took it all. Still, Gatsby had learned one thing. He would never be poor again. Tom comes to Gatsby's party. One afternoon, Tom Buchanan came to Gatsby's house with two friends. They were on horseback and stopped for a drink. Gatsby was happy. He wanted to be friends with Tom, but Tom was rude and uninterested. When Gatsby invited them to stay for dinner, the two friends left quickly. Tom stayed, but he did not enjoy Gatsby's world. Later, Tom told Daisy, "I think Gatsby is a bootlegger." He did not trust Gatsby at all. The big party. That Saturday, Gatsby had another big party. Daisy and Tom came together, but the party was not fun for them. Daisy did not like the guests. She did not like the loud music, the drinking, or the wild dancing. Gatsby wanted Daisy to be happy, but she was not impressed. Tom watched Gatsby closely. He thought Gatsby had made his money illegally. After the party, Gatsby was sad. He asked Nick, "Did she like it?" "She did not have a good time," Nick said honestly. Gatsby looked disappointed. Gatsby's dream. Gatsby wanted everything to be like the past. He wanted Daisy to love him again, just like before. "You can't repeat the past," Nick told him. "Yes, you can," Gatsby said firmly. He believed that if he had enough money, Daisy would leave Tom and love him again. But Nick was not sure. Could Gatsby really bring back the past? Chapter 7. Confrontation. Gatsby stops his parties. One Saturday night, I noticed something strange. Gatsby's house was dark and silent. There was no party. The next day, I visited Gatsby. "I have stopped my parties," he told me. "I fired my servants, too." "Why?" I asked. "I don't want gossip," Gatsby said. "Daisy comes here in the afternoons." Now Gatsby only cared about Daisy. He did not care about strangers at his parties anymore. Then Gatsby told me something else. "Daisy invited us for lunch tomorrow," he said. "Tom will be there." I felt nervous. Lunch at the Buchanan's house. The next day was very hot. I went to the Buchanan's house. Gatsby was already there. Daisy was sitting on the couch with Jordan. They looked tired from the heat. Tom was in the hallway, speaking on the phone. Jordan whispered, "It's Tom's girlfriend." Tom's face was angry. He slammed the phone down and walked into the room. Daisy smiled at Gatsby. "You always look so cool," she said. Their eyes met. In that moment, Tom understood. He saw that Daisy loved Gatsby. Tom's face turned red. He was angry and jealous. "What should we do today?" Daisy asked. "Let's go to New York." Tom agreed, but I could see his hands shaking. The trip to New York, we left in 2 cars. Tom drove Gatsby's yellow car. He took Jordan and me. Gatsby drove Tom's blue car. He took Daisy. On the way, Tom stopped at Wilson's garage for gas. George Wilson looked sick and pale. "I need to leave this place," Wilson said. "I know my wife is having an affair." Tom's face changed. He realized Wilson did not know Gatsby was involved. Myrtle Wilson was watching from the window. She looked at the yellow car. She thought Tom was driving it. The argument at the hotel. We arrived at a hotel in New York. It was very hot and everyone was sweating. Suddenly, Tom spoke loudly. "I found out about you, Gatsby," he said. "You are a bootlegger." Gatsby stayed calm. "Daisy never loved you, Tom," Gatsby said. Daisy's face turned white. "Tell him, Daisy," Gatsby said. "Tell him you never loved him." Daisy opened her mouth, but she could not speak. "I did love you once, Tom," she said softly. "But I loved Gatsby too." Gatsby's face fell. Tom laughed. "You see?" Tom said. "She will never leave me." Daisy looked at Gatsby. She was scared. Tom turned to Gatsby. "Go home, Gatsby. Take Daisy with you," Tom said coldly. Gatsby and Daisy left in the yellow car. Tom, Jordan, and I drove back later. The accident. As we drove through the Valley of Ashes, we saw a big crowd. There was an accident. A woman was dead. I saw Myrtle Wilson's body on the ground. A man said, "She was hit by a yellow car. The car did not stop." Tom looked shocked. Wilson was crying. "Who did this?" he shouted. Tom put a hand on Wilson's shoulder. "I'll find out," he said. Gatsby's love and hope. Back at Tom's house, Daisy was inside with Tom. I saw them sitting together, talking softly. Gatsby was outside in the dark. "I will stay here all night," Gatsby told me. "She will come to me," he said. She never loved Tom. But I was not sure. Would Daisy really leave Tom? Or was Gatsby dreaming? I walked away, leaving Gatsby waiting in the dark. Chapter 8. The End of a Dream, Nick's Warning to Gatsby. That night, I could not sleep. I kept thinking about Gatsby and Daisy. Early in the morning, I went to Gatsby's house. He was awake, sitting by a window. His face looked tired and pale. "Daisy never came out to see you, did she?" I asked. "No," Gatsby said quietly. "Tom won," I said. "You should leave this place. It's dangerous." But Gatsby shook his head. "I won't leave Daisy," he said. Gatsby's past with Daisy. Gatsby began to tell me about Daisy. He met her 5 years ago. She was young, beautiful, and rich. Many men loved her, but Gatsby was different. They spent time together, and Daisy fell in love with him. But Gatsby was poor. He had no money to marry her. Then the war took him away. Daisy waited for a while, but then Tom Buchanan came. Tom was rich, and he gave Daisy a good life. Gatsby came back too late. Daisy was already married. George Wilson's pain. Meanwhile, in the Valley of Ashes, George Wilson was heartbroken. His wife, Myrtle, was dead. Wilson sat in his garage, staring at the floor. A man named Michaelis, who owned a restaurant nearby, tried to help him. "You need rest," Michaelis said. But Wilson shook his head. "She had a lover," Wilson whispered. "I know she did." Then Wilson looked up at a big billboard. It was the sign of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg with 2 big blue eyes. Wilson stared at the eyes. "God sees everything," he said softly. Michaelis felt afraid. Wilson was losing his mind. The Murder of Gatsby. Later that day, Gatsby went for a swim in his pool. The summer was ending, but he had never used the pool before. I was at work, but I wanted to call him. I wanted to say, "Leave this place, Gatsby." But I never made the call. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby was floating in the water. He was thinking about Daisy. Then a shadow appeared behind the trees. It was George Wilson. He had a gun. A loud shot rang out. Gatsby was dead. Then Wilson turned the gun on himself. The dream was over. Nick finds Gatsby. I heard the news and rushed to Gatsby's house. His body was still in the pool. The servants were standing in shock. The police came. People whispered about Gatsby. But nobody really knew him. I looked at Gatsby's face. He was still young, still handsome. But now, he was gone. I thought about his dream, his love for Daisy, his hope for the past. Now, the dream was gone forever. Chapter 9. The end of the story. The morning after Gatsby's death, reporters, police, and photographers came to his house. They asked many questions, but nobody really knew the truth. The newspapers were full of lies. Some said Gatsby was a gangster. Others said he was a secret spy. There were even stories that he had killed Myrtle Wilson himself. Nobody cared about what really happened. I wanted to arrange Gatsby's funeral, but I felt completely alone. I thought Daisy would be heartbroken. She had loved Gatsby, and now he was gone. I called her house, but nobody answered. Later, the butler told me, "Mr. and Mrs. Buchanan left this afternoon." I was shocked. "Did they leave an address?" I asked. "No," he said. Daisy and Tom had disappeared. They didn't send flowers. They didn't call. They forgot Gatsby as if he had never existed. I felt angry. Gatsby gave his life for Daisy, but she didn't even care. The next morning, I received a telegram. It was from Henry C. Gatz, Gatsby's father. He was coming from Minnesota. When he arrived, he looked old and tired, dressed in simple clothes, but he was proud of Gatsby. "Jimmy always had big dreams," he told me. He showed me an old book from Gatsby's childhood. Inside the book, Gatsby had written a daily schedule. Wake up early, exercise, study, work hard, read books, improve myself. Even as a boy, Gatsby had wanted a better life. But now, his dreams had ended. I thought Gatsby's funeral would be big. He had so many friends at his parties. But I was wrong. I called Meyer Wolfsheim, Gatsby's business friend. "Gatsby is dead," I said. There was silence. Then he said, "I'm sorry, but I can't come. I don't want trouble." I called Klipspringer, the man who lived in Gatsby's house. "I can't come," he said. Then he asked, "Can you send me my shoes?" I was shocked. Gatsby had so many guests, but now nobody cared. The day of the funeral was cold and rainy. I waited, hoping people would come. But only 3 people stood near Gatsby's grave: his father, a priest, and me. At the last moment, Owl Eyes arrived. He was the man who had admired Gatsby's library. He stood in the rain, looking at the grave. Then he shook his head and said, "Such a big house, but no friends." Gatsby had been rich and powerful when he was alive, but now he was alone. After the funeral, I knew I could not stay in West Egg anymore. Every place reminded me of Gatsby. I decided to go back home. Before leaving, I saw Tom Buchanan in New York. I walked up to him and asked, "What did you say to Wilson that day?" Tom looked at me. I told him the truth, he said. I told him Gatsby owned the car. I stared at him. You knew Wilson was angry and dangerous, I said. You sent him to Gatsby to kill him. Tom looked away. He deserved it, Tom said, then walked off. I felt disgusted. Tom and Daisy broke things, hurt people, and then ran away. Before I left, I walked to Gatsby's house one last time. I stood at the dock, looking at the green light across the bay. This light was Gatsby's dream. He believed that if he had enough money, Daisy would love him again. But Gatsby's dream was too big. The past could never return. Now Gatsby was gone, but the green light still shined. I thought about Gatsby's hope. Even when things were impossible, he never stopped dreaming. Maybe that is why I respected him. I took one last look at Gatsby's empty house. Then I turned away and left West Egg forever.